Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant, and we welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers. Here we are 2 days away from the Kentucky primary election. Voters will pick party nominees for offices from president for the Democrats to Congress and legislative seats. There is a twist for Republicans who have already held a presidential caucus. They will have other contests on Tuesday. But for Democrats, there is a presidential primary Tuesday, and it could go down to the wire. Bernie Sanders carried every county in West Virginia last week when he won that state's primary. But Hillary Clinton's campaign has fought hard for Kentucky, which she easily carried back in 2008. The candidate herself has made 3 stops in Kentucky already, and she's coming back. Her daughter Chelsea has been to Lexington. She's coming back to Kentucky. And former President Bill Clinton has aggressively campaigned for his wife across Kentucky. Later, one of the most quoted political analysts in Kentucky, UK's Dr. Stephen Voss, will be joining us. We'll look at some of the campaigning by Clinton and Sanders' forces a little later. But first, Fayette County Court Clerk Don Blevins Jr. is here. Blevins is among the 120 local clerks across the state who are preparing for Tuesday alongside the State Board of Elections. He's joining us this morning. Mr. Blevins, thanks for being here.
Good morning, Bill. How are you?
I'm fine. And my first question is always fun, just before a primary to county clerks. Are the machines set on 0 and ready to go?
The machines are indeed set on 0 and ready to go.
And that's a process to get them in place and out to these polling places. Tell us a little bit about the challenges of getting workers trained, getting precinct locations identified.
Correct. We have a little over 1,000 pieces of equipment. We set those about a month ago. We've gone through testing and checking to make sure indeed they are set to 0. This week we've been delivering the machines to the various locations. It takes literally a week plus Monday to get all the machines in place. Election officers have been trained over the last month. We're ready to go.
How does that process go? Does that take quite some time to get the precinct workers ready?
Oh, yes. We have a little over 1,300 officers now, and it takes about 20 classes worth of election classes to get them trained, including machine training. That's an additional class for any new clerks.
And on that day, they have some pretty awesome responsibilities.
Absolutely, Bill. It's a long day. It's a thankless job, a 12-hour day, plus a little bit on the front end and back end. I hope people should turn out to make it worthwhile for all of us.
Across the state, we have a record number of Kentuckians registered to vote, 3.2 million or so. The Secretary of State is predicting a turnout of around 20%. Would you anticipate that Fayette County will best that number?
Maybe just a bit, but not much. This one's going to be hard to predict, Bill. The effect of the Bernie Sanders Hillary Clinton race will raise the Democrat turnout, I believe, but that will likely be offset by the lack of Republicans who seem to be confused about whether they even have a primary.
And let's talk a little bit about that, because it is confusing for Republicans. In some cases, there was a caucus instead in March.
Correct. So the Republican Party actually voted for its presidential candidates back in March in the caucus, as you said. But there are still other races that are on the ballot for the primary. You can vote for U.S. Senator, you can vote for U.S. Congress, and in a few precincts in Fayette County, you can actually vote for state representative. The 72nd district seat is being contested in the Republican side.
And we don't have any council seats that required primary, right?
No, there are no nonpartisan races. So if you're nonpartisan, there's no point in going to the polls because you have nothing you can vote for.
All right, which brings up a point. Kentucky has a closed primary, and that means you vote only within your party. Other states obviously have opted for an open primary, a trend that seems to be growing around the country. Do you think Kentucky would ever embrace that?
I don't think so. The current leadership in both the House and the Senate for both parties feels pretty strongly about the closed primary. You can make the argument that if we're going to have political parties, it seems only right that the people that are in that party vote for their candidates. The time certainly seems ripe for a third party to appear. I'd be interested to hear what your second guest has to say on that topic.
Do you say that the independents, you feel comfortable with the fact that they're basically just not welcome in this primary, that taxpayers are paying for to hold an election, but if you're registered independent, stay home?
Fair point. So if we're going to do parties only, maybe they should be picking up the cost of the primary, except maybe on those years where there's legit nonpartisan races on the ballot and we have to do it anyway.
We have a tough culture in Kentucky, as you know, of misdeeds on Election Day. What should people do if they see something wrong?
Well, the Attorney General as well as the State Board of Elections have well-publicized hotlines for that sort of thing. You can certainly call my office if you see something that you believe to be untoward or some sort of malfeasance, we'll be glad to report that for you. Fayette County is generally immune to that sort of thing. I certainly don't tolerate it even for a minute. Even minor infractions are reported by my office to the grand jury after each election. It's outside the county where you start to see issues. The biggest things I'm aware of, we still seem to have a problem with vote buying in Kentucky. That's the main thing. And the biggest exposure for potential problems is that and mail-in absentee ballots. Those are the two weak points in the system.
And so we have this process of walk-in absentee balloting that goes on in Kentucky, but that requires people to certify that for some reason they will be unable to go to the polls on Election Day. There's been some push and movement for early voting in Kentucky. Again, a trend in other states. Many states, you know, in Oregon they do it all by mail, but in some states there has been a movement toward more convenience of allowing early voting. How do you feel about that?
I oppose early voting for this simple reason: it hasn't worked. In those states that have tried it, there's a spike of usage, but it doesn't improve turnout at all. In fact, there's a couple of states where it seems to have suppressed turnout after a few years. West Virginia's got some nice statistics online that you can see, and there's a study out of a northern university, I want to say Minnesota or Wisconsin, that shows that it really doesn't improve turnout. It definitely improves convenience for those people who do vote. So what we find is that people that are going to vote anyway enjoy it. I would much more be interested in something that President Obama floated the other day. National holiday feels pretty good. There are still some businesses that don't adhere to the law and truly give their employees plenty of time to vote, so that would take care of that problem. And after that, I'm not sure what it's going to take to motivate Americans to get out to the polls. I mean, we've done everything we can. I've got locations within walking distance of most people in this county.
And yet the voters will say they're mad, they're angry, they want to you know, throw people out and throw people in and so forth, but then are not motivated to go to the polls.
I agree, and I can't explain it. If I had that magic pill, I certainly would send it out.
The online registration seems to be going well. People taking advantage of that opportunity. That was a change for Kentucky that the legislature did not enact. It was done by the Secretary of State. How do you feel that that's turned out?
Well, we had an initial spike of people trying it out, I'll say. It created a few unintended consequences. We had people going on just to try it out and would effectively re-register exactly as they were. So we had to watch for that. Once the newness wore off, I think it's going to be just another tool for folks to register. It's my belief that Motor Voter all those years ago, where you can register when you get your driver's license, pretty much cured the voter registration problem. We were well into the 90+% registered after that act. This is just one more step along the way.
Have you supported restoration of felon voting rights?
Absolutely. I think that's the right thing to do. I don't really care about the details of whether they have to wait a year or whatever, but I think after you've served your debt to society and you've come back, we should be actively getting you back and engaged in society, and certainly voting is one way to do that.
Kentucky's had a polling place electioneering ban that has been struck down in large measure, but that still means that there are some do's and don'ts on Election Day, right?
Right. Well, it's the argument over the 100 versus 300 feet away from the polling place. And what happens is you'll have a piece of private property that's close enough to be within the 300 feet, and you're infringing on the constitutional rights of that piece of private property. That said, Bill, I think electioneering at the polling place really needs to be restricted. So it seems like the courts have settled on a reasonable distance being 100 feet. So that's what we're doing right now.
This Tuesday, the polls will be open from 6 a.m. until 6 p.m. The rule is if you're in line at 6 o'clock, you may vote.
You may vote.
And as voters go to the polls on Tuesday, Mr. Blevins, what do they need to bring? What do they need to know as they show up?
All they really need to bring is a driver's license, a credit card with their signature on it, a photo ID with their signature on it, a passport, something to identify themselves so they can get on there, be checked into the roster, and then after that it's just pretty much vote.
And if there is a problem and they still insist that they are eligible to vote, they can vote a provisional ballot, right?
That's correct. In the federal races you can vote a provisional ballot. You also have the right to appeal to the local board of elections if you feel like you were registered on time. That's normal and okay. We do a few of those every election. Would like for folks to know that if there is an issue, you have a recourse.
And that's quick, and your folks are set up to do that, right?
The election officers are trained to contact the board, and then the voter would have to come downtown to be heard.
All right. Thanks for coming by. We appreciate
Glad
it.
to do
And
it.
as you said, hopefully the turnout will be better than what the predictions seem to indicate.
Amen.
Appreciate you coming. Coming next, one of Kentucky's most often quoted political experts, UK's Dr. Stephen Voss, on what to expect when voters go to the polls Tuesday. We'll be back on Kentucky Newsmakers. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers from WKYT. It's an amazing and historic year in American politics, and Kentucky gets another turn in the national spotlight coming this week with the closely watched Democratic primary. Dr. Stephen Voss is an expert on voting behavior, and he teaches political science at the University of Kentucky. He is joining us this morning as we discuss what has been, I don't know what word you would use, wild here? Is that
zany?
Is that operative enough? Right. Dr. Voss, welcome. Kentucky Democrats have their say in the presidential primary on Tuesday. The primary here is usually too late to count, but this time Hillary Clinton is still short of the number of delegates needed to clinch the national nomination. Are you surprised by the blitz of visits that we have seen from her campaign, from Bill Clinton, from Hillary Clinton herself, from Chelsea Clinton, and also Bernie Sanders barnstorming Kentucky this weekend?
Not at all. Hillary Clinton needs to stop the momentum Sanders has. This looks like a good state where to stage her defense for lots of reasons we could talk about. On the other hand, we have very little data about where this state's going to go, so Sanders certainly could see it as an opportunity to pull an upset.
He won West Virginia last week. In 2008, Hillary Clinton carried every county. In 2016, Sanders carried every county, and Hillary Clinton lost. How is Kentucky different? How is it the same as West Virginia?
Okay, one big difference that we have from West Virginia is that this is a closed primary. You talked about in the earlier segment, it's a closed primary. Independents cannot vote in the Democratic primary. Republicans cannot vote in the Democratic primary. And that means it's only among people who are registered Democrats. They have been supporting Hillary Clinton much more than independents who have sort of raided the Democratic primary to help Sanders win in other states. So that's a good advantage for Clinton. We also have a lot of registered Democrats who are fairly conservative politically. We haven't done what a lot of the Deep South did, which is all the social conservatives becoming Republicans. And so some of these Democrats are not natural Sanders supporters. They would normally be much more likely to support, someone with her roots in Arkansas than someone with roots in Vermont and a liberal Democrat. Now, what kind of upsets that apple cart is in West Virginia, people who were conservative, who you would not at all have expected to vote for Bernie Sanders ideologically, gave him support. These Trump supporters who were able to raid the Democratic primary in West Virginia supported Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton. If she's not picking up the more conservative Democrats the way she normally would, then all bets are off in terms of this state being an advantage for her.
Bill Clinton carried Kentucky twice in 1992 and 1996, but that was a generation ago at this point, and Bernie Sanders seems to have that hold with young voters, certainly. In fact, one of his visits will be in Bowling Green, the home of Western Kentucky University. The coal issue is huge as well. How do those factors play?
Well, the coal thing's kind of a puzzle because I can't believe anybody in coal country would think Bernie Sanders was going to adopt policies more supportive of than Clinton would of the coal industry. But Hillary Clinton did make some statements that suggested hostility to coal, and you know how sometimes it's what you say that matters more than what you'll do. And they've gotten a lot of play out of the coal statements. The students are a puzzle as well. They're overwhelmingly for Sanders, but college is out now. And they don't have that sort of echo effect of the students, drumming up mobilization. And one thing we know about when people vote, it's when the community around them is sort of pushing them to the polls. They're not in that Sanders-dominated community anymore.
Some might say they can do it with social media, and that they are back home where they're likely to be registered to vote, though.
I don't know how much they're on their computers either these days. Summer vacations just kicked in.
A break.
Yeah.
So all in all, when you look at Kentucky, you seem to be feeling like that Clinton has some advantage.
Certainly compared to West Virginia, I'm expecting she'll do better. I mean, you have Louisville, which is the sort of place where Hillary Clinton's been doing very well, and of course that's our biggest concentration of Democrats. Lexington, I think, would also be fairly natural for her, especially if the students don't vote. Western Kentucky normally would be more hers. Although I think Sanders sees some opportunities there. As you said, he's going to appear out there. The eastern part of the state's tough, but there are a lot of registered Republicans out there. So unlike with the sort of coal country vote in West Virginia, which was able to pitch a lot of support to Sanders, a lot of the folks out in the eastern part of the state, especially in Hal Rogers' district, they can't weigh in because they're registered Republican.
Let's talk about the delegate math at this point, and then there are so-called pledged delegates and so-called superdelegates. What is the difference, and how fluid is that math at this point?
So the Democratic Party realized after losing a series of elections about a generation ago that having the system too open and too controlled by voters could leave them with a candidate who would fail in the general election. And they decided maybe we need a system that's a little less small d democratic, a little less voter driven, but one that gives us what we're looking for in the long run by giving us a Democrat who can win. And so they introduced what we call superdelegates. And these are people who get to vote on who the Democratic presidential candidate will be by virtue of some position they've held with the party or a position they hold at the current time. Those folks get to vote how they want. When you see Hillary Clinton dominating Bernie Sanders in the nomination contest, usually that's because they've done the math using these superdelegates who have sort of endorsed her. But they can change later. The other ones, the ones that are driven by the voters, and this is the majority of them, they are kind of locked in, at least at first, for sure. They're locked in how they vote. She's winning there. She's beating Sanders a little bit less than 55-45. But it's not as wide a lead as she has among those people who have the flexibility. Even then, she's got a commanding lead, and in most of these states, he can't win them all. So she's going to keep, even if she loses states, she keeps winning some of those states' delegates, and the math is really, really tight for him. Kentucky directly is not going to change that. We only have 55 that the voters decide, 5 more who are these superdelegates who get to pick, and 60 delegates is a drop in the bucket. This state matters symbolically because we're one of only 2 states voting on that day, and it's going to send a signal going into California and a bunch of other states about whether Sanders has any chance of closing Clinton's lead.
So momentum is the issue at
Momentum,
this point.
symbolism. That's right.
If you are Bernie Sanders, and you say you're staying in it, is it to affect the party platform more at this point then?
Well, like I said, it's not impossible yet. It's getting close to impossible he can win, but it's not yet. He's already pulled Hillary Clinton left, or at least pulled the sort of focus of her message leftward, and so he's had an effect, I think, already on the presidential election. He's planting seeds for later on down the road. It may not be him, but it may be, say, Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. But he's mobilizing progressives, setting up these left-wing networks, the mailing lists, the email and social media lists that a later progressive could use. There are a lot of things he's doing to change the Democratic Party, even if he doesn't get the nomination.
How much is there just anger in America that is resulting in on both sides? There's just been a movement toward candidates who express that sort of anti-establishment, anti-Washington feeling.
The funny thing is we've had this anger for a long time. A generation ago, people were worried that there was so much cynicism and distrust and anger that voters were going to be willing to tear down the system, and they didn't. The closest we got was, Ross Perot's early 90s presidential campaign that did decently well, but it didn't really affect anything. This generation, we've got that anger again, but there's also a difference, which is people are much more comfortable with the idea of putting novices, people with no executive experience, limited political experience, in the highest office in the land. You have Donald Trump on the GOP side, Bernie Sanders getting a lot of play as a sort of backbench independent senator on the Democratic side. People seem really comfortable giving the mechanisms of control of the most powerful nation in the world to somebody with not much experience.
And when you take away military heroes who themselves were over large areas of government, the United States has not done that very often. We've typically chosen people who have political experience.
Yes, there used to be a career ladder like anything else, right? Who do you want doing the surgery on you? Someone who's got some experience in the hospital. Who do you want representing you in front of the courts? A lawyer who knows the law and has been fighting for a while. a lot of voters want someone running the country who's never run anything like a country before.
There will be some other races on Tuesday. Of course, the U.S. Senate race. Rand Paul seems well positioned, obviously, in his primary. On the Democratic side, Lexington Mayor Jim Gray has been talked about as the front runner with name recognition and is spending money. Celeste Wilder of Frankfort, though, seems to be tapping into that progressive movement to some extent. Would you agree with that scenario?
You know, the last couple of big statewide Democrats, Grimes when she ran for the Senate, Conway when he ran for governor, there was some sort of protest vote within the Democratic Party for candidates who didn't have funding and weren't well known. And people looked at the sort of protest vote against them as a sign of trouble. Wilder does have an advantage, which is he can get both the protest vote and he can get that group of connected progressives who are angry at the Democratic Party for putting forward mainstream candidates. And with Sanders getting a lot of those progressive voters to the polls, and then their willingness to go down ticket and support Wilder. You know, Gray may get it, he may be a shoo-in, but the question is how good or how bad does his margin look? Because, you know, potential donors, potential activists, the party in D.C., they're going to be watching to see how strong or how weak he looks. It matters to him.
Less than a minute left as we look ahead to the fall. You expect it to be just as interesting as the spring has been in America?
I think there's more chaos to come.
You predict a lively election season. I would say not only to the presidential race, but with the other offices as well.
Well, I mean, with the presidential race, we're going to see more protests. You know, likely violent protests at times. We're going to see Donald Trump, you know, violate almost any norm, any expectation that will keep the presidential election uncertain, and it won't settle into any kind of rut. And the Senate is up for grabs. This may not be the Democrats' best chance, but they across the country, it looks as though not only could they keep the White House, but the U.S. Senate could flip back to the Democratic Party.
And obviously, Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate. Thanks for coming, Dr. Haas. We appreciate it very much. In just a moment, some flavor from the campaign trail ahead of the Kentucky primary. Welcome back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. The Clinton and Sanders forces have been working Kentucky hard and are still working ahead of the Democratic presidential primary. And we're going to hear a little bit from the Clintons and also from Bernie Sanders here.
Some of the issues that face other parents, like equal work for equal pay, don't really affect me because somebody else is bargaining that so that I don't have to worry about that, as well as our healthcare system.
Right. That makes a really big difference.
It's huge.
And you know, there are still so many problems with people being paid less than they deserve, not getting overtime, not getting fair pay, women not getting equal pay. And it's one of the reasons why unionized workers are able to feel, you know, better taken care of, because you know what you're supposed to get. You know the compensation you're supposed to get, you know the benefits you're supposed to get, and there's an equality of it that, you know, somebody doing your job in another place but with the same union gets the same
Correct.
benefits and compensation, right?
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why with the decline of unionization, you've seen the decline of the middle class. It goes hand in hand. And even people who aren't in unions don't understand how if you drive down overall bargained compensation, you drive it down for everybody who are not even in unions. So it has a ripple effect. Right?
We are going to impose a tax on Wall Street speculation. Eight years ago, when Wall Street's greed and recklessness and illegal behavior brought this country into the worst economic decline since the Great Depression, Congress, against my vote, bailed them out. Well, in my view, now is the time for Wall Street to help the middle class of this country. This campaign is listening to senior citizens, disabled veterans, and people who have disabilities. A great nation is not judged by the number of millionaires or nuclear weapons it has.
So what Hillary wants to do is to give a public option, let people in the insurance market, if it doesn't work for them anymore, and that'll be a lot of people in Kentucky now, buy into Medicare if they're over 55, buy into Medicaid if they're under 55, and we'll get to 100% insured. Then we got to bargain down the price of prescription drugs like every other country does, and get more people in health care plans where you pay to stay healthy instead of paying by procedure. Every place in America where that's done, every place, health care improves and the costs go down. Now, the other thing we got to do is make college accessible to everybody that wants it. Now, there are two different positions here. Free tuition for everybody, and Hillary's position, which is debt-free graduation for everybody, and a manageable debt plan. Now, the problem with the free tuition plan is it requires the states to come up with a third of the match. What do you think the chances are that this governor and this legislature would pay for a third of the tuition after they just got through cutting higher ed? So here's what Hillary wants to do. The states are, look, there are states governed by Democrats with Democratic legislatures that are in financial trouble today. So what she says is, look, let's make it debt-free, and that way we can cover more colleges. If you need free tuition, you get it.
Well, it's an interesting time. We want to thank you for joining us for Kentucky Newsmakers. Again, the primary is Tuesday. We'll have coverage on WKYT. You make it a good week ahead.